The Salmon River ran cold that September morning, its voice the only conversation Elias Hartley had known for 3 winters. He stood at his cabin door, massive frame filling the threshold, watching mist rise from the water like departing souls. His crosscut saw waited against the pine, teeth hungry for today's timber. At 34, Elias had the shoulders of an ox and hands that could snap a branch thick as a man's wrist. Yet those same hands trembled slightly as he wound his father's pocket watch stopped forever at 3:17, the moment the old man's heart quit in an Ohio wheat field. The wilderness asked nothing of him except honest work. No questions about the wife who'd chosen another man. No explanations for why he'd traveled 2,000 miles to live where no human voice could reach him. Today felt different. The forest held its breath, waiting. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The sun hung directly overhead when Elias first heard the sound, a soft whimper, like a wounded animal. He set down his saw, wiping sweat from his brow with a sleeve already soaked through. The noise came again, weaker this time, from beyond the stand of cottonwoods marking his eastern boundary. He found the boy collapsed against a fallen log, knees drawn up, face hidden in thin arms. No more than 10 years old, Elias guessed, though hunger made it hard to tell. The child's buckskin shirt hung torn, revealing ribs that pressed against brown skin like tent poles. Dark hair, matted with dirt and fever sweat, covered most of his face. Elias knelt slowly, the way he'd approach a spooked horse. That's when he saw it, the beaded necklace tight around the boy's throat. Not just any necklace. The pattern of blue and white, the eagle feather hanging from its center, the small copper disc etched with symbols. His stomach tightened. He'd seen such markings before, on the son of Chief Standing Elk when the tribe had passed through 2 summers back, trading at Henderson's Post downriver. The boy's eyes fluttered open, deep brown, glazed with fever, full of terror. He tried to scramble backward but only managed to fall sideways into the dirt. "Easy now," Elias said, keeping his voice low, steady. "Easy." The smart thing would be to walk away. Let the boy's people find him. Getting tangled in tribal matters meant trouble no man needed. But those eyes, Lord help him. They looked just like his nephew Tommy's had, that last Christmas in Ohio, when scarlet fever took him. Elias glanced at the forest, then back at the child. A raven called overhead, harsh and mocking. The boy's breathing came shallow, rattled. Another hour in this heat, maybe less, and it wouldn't matter whose son he was. "Not my trouble," Elias muttered, but his hands were already sliding under the boy's weight, lifting him like he weighed nothing. The child moaned, head lolling against Elias's chest. Through the torn shirt, Elias could feel the furnace heat of fever. He turned toward his cabin, each step carrying him further from the simple life he'd carved out. Behind them, a scrap of beaded buckskin caught on a blackberry vine fluttered like a flag of surrender, marking the spot where everything changed. Inside the cabin, Elias worked with practiced efficiency. He laid the boy on his own narrow bed, just pine boards and a thin mattress stuffed with dried grass, but better than the dirt floor. The child's fever burned hot enough to warm the small space. Elias pumped water into his wash basin, the handle squeaking its familiar protest, and grabbed the last clean rag from the line. "Mape," the boy whispered, lips cracked like dried clay. The Lakota word for water, Elias recognized it from his dealings with traders. He supported the child's head, trickling water between his lips. Most ran down his chin, but some got through. The boy's throat worked, swallowing painfully. Elias reached for the carbolic soap, its sharp medicinal smell filling the cabin as he cleaned the worst of the dirt from the child's face and arms. Scratches covered his legs, some deep enough to worry about. How long had he been wandering? The boy's eyes tracked Elias's movements, wary but too weak for real fear. When Elias brought out the cornmeal to make mush, adding precious sorghum molasses from his dwindling supply, those eyes widened slightly. The sweet smell seemed to reach past the fever's fog. "Need to get some food in you," Elias said, more to himself than the child. He knew the boy likely didn't understand English, but talking felt necessary somehow. like crossing a bridge between their worlds. Slow and easy, though. Your stomach's not ready for much. He spooned the warm mush carefully, remembering how his mother had fed him during his own childhood illnesses. The boy managed 3 spoonfuls before turning his head away, exhausted by even that small effort. As afternoon light slanted through the cabin's single window, Elias noticed something that made his chest tighten. The boy's distinctive shirt, the one that marked him as someone important, had caught on his saw blade outside, leaving a telltale tear and a strip of fabric still hanging from the teeth. Evidence of their meeting that couldn't be denied or explained away. The child slept fitfully, sometimes crying out words Elias couldn't understand. He kept the cloth cool on the boy's forehead, changed it when it grew warm, and found himself humming an old hymn his mother used to sing. Rock of Ages, slow and low, the melody seeming to calm them both. By evening, the fever had broken. The boy's breathing came easier, deeper. Elias sat on an upturned crate beside the bed, watching this unexpected responsibility sleep. Through the window, he could see storm clouds building over the mountains. Change was coming in more ways than one. He'd need to make a decision soon. Take the boy to Henderson's trading post, maybe, hope someone there could return him to his people. But that was 2 days' journey, and the child was too weak to travel. Besides, if Chief Standing Elk's band was searching for his son, they'd track him here eventually. The torn fabric on the saw guaranteed it. The boy stirred, opened his eyes fully for the first time. They studied each other in the dim light, the massive white woodcutter and the chief's lost son. Then, surprising them both, the child's small hand reached out, fingers barely touching Elias's weathered knuckles. Not grabbing, not afraid, just connecting. "Well," Elias said quietly, "I guess you're staying for a spell." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the cabin's roof like distant drums. Elias didn't know it yet, but those drums would soon become real, and what started with one small act of kindness would reshape the very boundaries of his world. The next morning brought clear skies and a surprising sight. The boy was sitting up, still weak but alert, examining his surroundings with intelligent eyes. Elias had made more cornmeal mush, this time adding wild blackberries he'd gathered at dawn. The child ate slowly but steadily, strength returning with each spoonful. When Elias pointed to himself and said, "Elias," then pointed to the boy with a questioning look, the child understood immediately. "Dakota," he said, voice small but clear. Then, touching his chest again, "Dakota." It was a beginning. Elias showed him the hand pump, demonstrated how to prime it with the tin cup kept hanging nearby. Dakota watched intently, then tried it himself, smiling slightly when water flowed. Such a simple thing, but it felt like building a bridge one plank at a time. They spent the morning in careful communication gestures, pointing, simple words repeated until understood. Elias learned that Dakota had been on some kind of journey alone, a ritual perhaps, when he'd gotten lost. The boy drew pictures in the dirt beside the cabin, showing mountains, a river, tiny figures that must be his people. By noon, Dakota was strong enough to walk to the door, though Elias stayed close, ready to catch him if he stumbled. The boy stood at the threshold, looking out at the forest, then back at Elias. The question in his eyes was clear: was he free to go? Elias nodded, gestured to the woods. "You can go," he said, knowing the words weren't understood, but hoping the tone was, "when you're ready." But Dakota didn't leave. Instead, he pointed to the sun, then made a walking motion with 2 fingers, then pointed to himself and shook his head, too weak still for the journey home. He needed more time. That afternoon, while Dakota rested, Elias couldn't stop thinking about the torn fabric on his saw. He went out to look at it again, that telltale piece of beaded buckskin fluttering in the breeze like a signal flag. He thought about removing it, but that felt dishonest somehow. If trouble was coming, he'd meet it straight on. As the sun set on their second day together, Elias was teaching Dakota to play cat's cradle with a length of rope when they both heard a sound that made Dakota go rigid and Elias's blood run cold. Drums. Distant but distinct, echoing through the valley like a heartbeat growing stronger. Dakota's eyes went wide. He spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing urgently. Elias didn't need to understand the words to grasp the meaning. "They're coming. My people are coming for me." The morning after the drums fell silent brought an unexpected peace. Dakota woke with clear eyes, the last of his fever gone, and pointed to Elias's breakfast preparations with obvious interest. The big man was frying salt pork, its smoky scent filling the cabin, and Dakota's stomach growled audibly. They both laughed, the first real laugh they'd shared. Elias set 2 plates on his rough table, a luxury he hadn't bothered with in 3 years of solitary meals. Dakota sat carefully on the wooden crate Elias used as a second seat, his feet dangling well above the floor. The boy ate with focused concentration, using the fork awkwardly but determinedly, mimicking Elias's movements. After breakfast, Elias stepped outside to his daily work, and Dakota followed like a shadow. The morning ritual fascinated the boy, watching Elias strop his straight razor on the leather hanging by the door, test its edge with his thumb, then scrape away yesterday's stubble with practiced strokes. Dakota touched his own smooth chin, making Elias chuckle. "Give it a few years, boy," he said, wiping the blade clean. "You'll be cursing this chore same as every man." The language barrier should have made everything harder, but somehow it simplified things. They communicated in gestures, expressions, and demonstrations. When Elias picked up his axe to split kindling, Dakota immediately moved to gather the pieces, stacking them with surprising precision for someone his age. They developed a rhythm. Elias would split, Dakota would stack. When the pile grew too heavy for the boy's thin arms, he'd drop it all with a clatter, sending wood rolling across the packed earth. The first time it happened, Dakota's face crumpled with shame, but Elias just laughed, a deep, rusty sound that seemed to surprise them both. "No harm done," Elias said, helping gather the scattered pieces. He demonstrated carrying smaller loads, making multiple trips. Dakota nodded seriously, as if receiving crucial wisdom. By midday, Elias had an idea. He strung a rope between the cabin and a sturdy pine, then rigged a simple pulley system with an old wheel from a broken cart. He attached a basket to the rope and showed Dakota how to load light kindling and pull it across to the woodpile. The boy's eyes lit up with understanding and delight. He pulled the rope eagerly, watching the basket travel its path, then ran to unload it and send it back. "You're a natural engineer," Elias said, ruffling the boy's dark hair. Dakota beamed, not understanding the words but feeling the approval. That afternoon, they ventured to the blackberry brambles along the creek. Elias brought 2 tin cups, his coffee mug, and an old cup he'd forgotten he owned. He showed Dakota how to pick only the dark, soft berries, avoiding the red ones that would sour their stomachs. The boy proved adept at finding the best fruit, his smaller fingers navigating the thorns better than Elias's massive hands. They ate as they picked, purple juice staining their fingers and mouths. Dakota found this hilarious, pointing at Elias's purple-streaked beard and giggling. Elias couldn't remember the last time he'd heard genuine laughter in his clearing. It echoed off the trees like birdsong, when they'd filled both cups. Dakota suddenly grabbed Elias's hand, tugging him toward a cluster of plants near the water. The boy knelt, carefully uprooting something Elias had always considered a weed. Dakota brushed the dirt from its roots, broke off a piece, and handed it to Elias with an expectant look. Elias sniffed it, pungent, earthy, almost like ginger. Dakota mimed eating, then rubbed his stomach with a pained expression, then smiled and patted it peacefully. "Medicine for stomach troubles." Elias nodded, impressed. The boy knew things about this land that Elias, for all his 3 years here, had never learned. As the sun lowered, they sat by the river, using sticks to draw in the sandy bank. Elias sketched his journey, a rough map of Ohio, the trail west, the mountains, and finally a little square representing his cabin. He drew a woman next to a house back in Ohio, then crossed her out, pointed to himself walking away. Dakota studied the drawing solemnly, seeming to understand. The boy took his own stick and began drawing. First, many triangular lodges arranged in a circle. Then horses, lots of them, a figure larger than the others with lines radiating from his head, a chief's headdress, Elias realized. Dakota pointed to the chief, then to himself, making the connection clear. He drew the chief and a woman together, then a smaller figure between them. Family. Next, Dakota drew himself walking away from the lodges, alone, heading into stylized mountains. He made sleeping gestures, then drew wavy lines, getting lost, confused. Finally, he drew Elias's cabin and pointed to where they sat now. Vision quest, Elias said quietly. He'd heard of the practice young boys sent out alone to find their spiritual path, to become men. But Dakota was so young, and something had gone wrong. The boy had gotten turned around, lost his way in unfamiliar territory. Dakota drew one more thing, many figures coming from the lodges toward the cabin. Warriors, searching. He looked at Elias with worried eyes, clearly afraid of bringing trouble to this man who'd saved him. Elias placed his large hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing gently. He pointed to himself, then to Dakota, then made a protective gesture, arms crossed over his chest like a shield. The message was clear. I'll keep you safe until they come. That evening, they prepared dinner together. Elias had taught Dakota to work the hand pump, priming it with the tin cup of water kept beside it. The boy took this job seriously, filling the pot for beans while Elias cut salt pork into small pieces for flavor. They worked in companionable silence, occasionally catching each other's eye and sharing small smiles. After dinner, Elias brought out his harmonica, a battered Hohner marine band he'd carried since the war. The first notes made Dakota's eyes widen with wonder. Elias played Shenandoah, slow and mournful, the melody carrying across the water. When he finished, Dakota held out his hands, asking to see the instrument. Elias showed him how to hold it, how to blow gently into the chambers. The resulting squawk sent them both into laughter. But Dakota persisted, and soon managed a few clear notes. He handed it back and made playing gestures more. Please. So Elias played old hymns, folk songs, even a jaunty tune from his army days. Dakota listened with rapt attention, his head swaying slightly with the rhythm. When full dark came, the boy was fighting sleep, his head nodding forward then jerking back up. Come on, young man, Elias said, lifting Dakota easily. The boy didn't protest, just wrapped his thin arms around Elias's neck, already half asleep. Elias settled him on the bed, covering him with the wool blanket. Dakota murmured something in Lakota, soft and content. Elias sat in his chair by the door, keeping watch as he'd done every night since finding the boy. But tonight felt different. The cabin didn't seem empty anymore. The shadows held no loneliness, just peaceful quiet. For the first time in 3 years, Elias Hartley didn't feel alone. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere far off, a wolf howled at the rising moon. But inside the cabin, there was only the sound of peaceful breathing and the creak of Elias's chair as he settled in for the night watch. Whatever tomorrow brought, drums, warriors, consequences, tonight there was just an unlikely friendship between a lost boy and a lonely man, built from berries and harmonica songs and purple-stained smiles. The trust they'd built felt as solid as the logs that made his walls. And like those logs, carefully fitted and chinked against the weather, it would need to be strong enough to withstand the storm that was surely coming. The next morning brought teaching moments neither of them expected. Dakota woke early, slipping outside while Elias still dozed in his chair. The big man startled awake to find the boy kneeling by the creek, carefully peeling bark from a willow tree. When Dakota saw Elias watching, he held up the inner bark, pointed to his head, then made a drinking motion. Medicine for headaches. That's so. Elias crouched beside him, genuinely curious. His mother had used willow bark tea back in Ohio, but he'd never learned to identify the right trees. Dakota showed him the leaves, the pattern of the bark, the way it smelled when fresh peeled. The boy was patient, repeating the demonstration until Elias could identify the medicinal willow from its cousins along the bank. They spent the morning this way, Dakota leading Elias through his own land like a tiny professor. Here was yarrow for wounds Dakota mimed bleeding, then pressing the leaves against the imaginary cut. There was wild ginger for stomach troubles, different from the root he'd shown yesterday. The boy knew which mushrooms would feed you and which would kill you, though he made exaggerated dying gestures to show Elias should never eat the wrong ones. At one point, Dakota stopped by a fallen log, rotting and moss-covered. He knocked on it, listening, then beckoned Elias over. Together they rolled it aside, revealing fat white grubs beneath. Dakota popped one in his mouth, chewing with apparent satisfaction, then offered one to Elias. "I'll stick to salt pork. Thank you kindly," Elias said, holding up his hands. Dakota shrugged, helped himself to another, then carefully replaced the log. Even the grubs were part of the forest's design. His gestures seemed to say, everything had its purpose. By noon, Elias decided to share his own knowledge. He brought out his timber cruiser's stick, a long pole marked with the Doyle scale that helped calculate board feet in standing trees. Dakota examined it with the same intense focus he brought to everything, running his fingers along the notches. Elias demonstrated on a medium pine, showing how to measure the diameter at chest height, then used the stick to estimate height. He scratched numbers in the dirt multiplication that would tell you how much usable lumber stood in that living tree. Dakota's eyes followed every movement, and when Elias handed him the stick, the boy immediately went to another tree to try. His first attempt was clumsy, but his second showed understanding. By the third tree, Dakota was scratching his own numbers in the dirt, looking to Elias for confirmation. The mathematics were beyond him, but he grasped the concept, measuring what the forest could provide without destroying it all. "You'd make a fine timber cruiser," Elias said, impressed. "Course, your people might have something to say about you joining that profession." They worked until mid-afternoon, when clouds began building over the mountains. Dakota studied them intently, then tugged on Elias's sleeve, pointing to the cabin. He made rain gestures, then held up 3 fingers. 3 hours. 3 hours till rain. Elias squinted at the sky. The clouds didn't look that threatening to him. But he'd learned to trust the boy's forest wisdom. They spent the time securing equipment and covering the woodpile with canvas. Exactly 3 hours later, the first drops fell. They sat in the doorway, protected by the small overhang, watching the rain sweep across the clearing. Dakota picked up a piece of charcoal from the cold fireplace and began drawing on a flat piece of bark. He sketched clouds, then added symbols beneath them, curves and lines that seemed to indicate different types of weather coming. "Weather signs," Elias murmured. "You're reading the sky like a book." The boy drew more a circle for the sun, showing its position at different times, then different cloud shapes beside each position. Morning clouds from the west meant one thing, evening clouds from the north another. It was a complex system, refined over generations, and Dakota was teaching it with patient determination. As the rain intensified, they moved inside. Elias brought out his harmonica again, but this time Dakota stopped him, running outside despite the downpour. He returned soaked but triumphant, carrying a piece of river cane. Using Elias's knife with surprising skill, the boy fashioned a simple flute, cutting holes with careful precision. When he blew into it, a clear, sweet note emerged. Different holes made different sounds. Dakota played a simple melody, not quite music as Elias knew it, but something older, like wind through trees or water over stones. Then he pointed to Elias's harmonica, gesturing for him to play along. They spent an hour finding harmony, the harmonica's metal twang blending with the flute's woody breath. Sometimes they matched notes, sometimes they clashed and laughed, but gradually they found rhythms that worked. Dakota taught Elias a simple pattern 3 notes repeated, then a 4th held long, a song of his people, perhaps, or maybe just something he made up. Either way, it became theirs. As evening approached and the rain tapered to a drizzle, they prepared dinner together with practiced ease. Dakota knew now to prime the pump. Elias knew to save the tender inner portions of any plant the boy identified as edible. They'd developed a system. Dakota gathered kindling while Elias handled the heavy work. Then they'd cook side by side, the boy standing on a crate to reach the table properly. Tonight's meal included some of the roots Dakota had found, roasted alongside the usual beans and salt pork. They tasted nutty, almost like potatoes, but sweeter. Elias made appreciative sounds, and Dakota beamed with pride. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Dakota grew serious. He drew in the ashes with the stick warriors again, many of them, moving through trees. He looked at Elias, pointed to the drawings, then to his ear. Listen, they're still searching. Elias nodded. He'd sensed it too, a watchfulness in the forest. Birds startling at odd moments, deer paths showing more footprints than deer would make. The drums had been silent for 2 days, but that didn't mean the search had stopped. Dakota drew something else, the sun rising and setting, 5 times. 5 days since he'd left his people. They would be growing desperate. The boy's expression was troubled, torn between his growing attachment to Elias and his knowledge of what his absence meant to his family. They'll find you, Elias said gently, and when they do, I'll make sure they understand. You were sick, needed help, no harm done. But even as he said it, Elias wondered if it would be that simple. A chief's son didn't just disappear without consequences, and a white man holding him, even with good intentions, might not be seen charitably. That night, Dakota taught Elias to play cup and pin, a game made with a pointed stick and hollowed-out nuts with holes in them. The goal was to catch the nuts on the stick point harder than it looked. Dakota was expert at it, catching 3 or 4 in succession. Elias managed one, occasionally, sending them both into fits of laughter at his clumsy attempts. When bedtime came, Dakota didn't immediately go to the bed. Instead, he stood before Elias, speaking earnestly in Lakota. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was clear gratitude, affection, and something else. Apology, maybe, for the trouble he knew was coming. Elias placed both hands on the boy's thin shoulders. Whatever happens, he said, I'm glad you found my clearing. House was too quiet anyway. Dakota hugged him then, quick and fierce, before scrambling to bed. Elias sat by the dying fire, whittling a toy horse from a piece of pine. He'd give it to the boy tomorrow, something to remember their strange friendship by. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the night sounds returned: owls, crickets, the rustle of small creatures. But underneath it all, Elias could feel the approach of something larger. The forest was holding its breath again, just as it had the morning he found Dakota. Change was coming with the dawn. He could feel it in his bones, the way he used to feel storms during the war. But this time, he wouldn't face it alone. This time, he had someone worth protecting, someone who'd taught him that understanding could grow in the most unlikely soil. The toy horse took shape under his knife mane, tail, 4 strong legs, like the friendship it represented, built with patience and care from raw material. Tomorrow would test its strength, but tonight it was perfect in its simple form. The drums began at sunset, a sound that made Elias's blood run cold and Dakota go rigid at the table where they'd been sharing supper. Not the distant echo of before, but close, so close the rhythmic beating seemed to come from the trees themselves. The boy's spoon clattered to his plate, beans forgotten, his dark eyes wide with recognition. Your people, Elias said. It wasn't a question. Dakota nodded, then spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing toward the door, toward himself, toward Elias. The meaning was clear enough. They're here. They've come for me. What do we do? Elias rose slowly from the table, his mind racing through options. He could run, take the boy deeper into the mountains, but that would only make things worse. He could send Dakota out alone, but the boy was grabbing his sleeve, clearly frightened of facing whatever judgment awaited him. No. There was only one choice: meet this head-on with truth. Stay close to me, Elias said, placing a protective hand on Dakota's shoulder. We'll face this together. He moved around the cabin with purpose, gathering what he thought of as evidence. The torn piece of buckskin still hung from his saw blade. He'd left it there deliberately, knowing this moment would come. He retrieved the wooden bowl he'd used to feed Dakota that first day, still stained with cornmeal mush and molasses. The makeshift bed of pine boughs and traded blankets in the corner, clearly made for someone small. Each item told part of their story. The drums grew louder, multiplying. Not just one drummer now, but many. Their beats synchronizing into a rhythm that seemed to shake the very ground. Dakota was trembling, and Elias pulled him close, feeling the boy's rapid heartbeat against his side. "Remember," Elias said, kneeling to look Dakota in the eye. "You did nothing wrong. You got lost. I helped you. That's the truth. And truth has its own power." Through the window, the first glimmers of torchlight appeared between the trees. Not one or two flames, but dozens. Then scores, moving through the forest like fallen stars. The lights grew brighter, closer, until they seemed to surround the cabin entirely. Elias had seen battle, had faced Confederate charges and cavalry raids, but this was different. This was judgment approaching on silent feet. Dakota tugged at his sleeve, pointing to the door. The boy's face had changed, set with a determination that seemed beyond his years. He spoke again in Lakota, then placed his small hand over Elias's heart, then his own. Together. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The drums stopped. The silence was worse than the noise, heavy and expectant. Elias could hear his own breathing. Dakota's quick gasps, the pop of sap in the dying fire, then footsteps, many of them, and shadows moving past the windows. The torchlight cast dancing patterns on the walls, making the small cabin feel even smaller. A voice called out in Lakota, deep, commanding, edged with barely controlled anger. Dakota flinched, but stepped toward the door. Elias caught his shoulder, shaking his head. If they were going out, they'd go together, and they'd go when he was ready. He gathered the evidence items in his arms, the bowl, the blankets, even grabbed the toy horse he'd been carving. Then he lifted the latch, took a deep breath, and stepped into the night with Dakota beside him. The sight that greeted them stole his breath. Warriors stood in a perfect semicircle around his cabin, at least 200 of them, painted for war, weapons held but not raised. Their torches created a wall of light, and in that light, Elias could see faces, some young, some old, all deadly serious. These weren't the reservation Indians he'd seen at trading posts, subdued and dependent. These were warriors in their prime, and they'd come for their chief's son. At the center of the semicircle stood a man who could only be Chief Standing Elk, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a ceremonial headdress that caught the torchlight like captured flame. His face was painted in black and red, traditional war colors, but it was his eyes that held Elias dark, intelligent, and furious. Beside the chief stood a smaller man in mixed clothing, buckskin leggings but a wool vest, traditional moccasins but a trader's felt hat. The interpreter, Elias realized, the man who would decide how his words were understood. The chief spoke, his voice carrying across the clearing like thunder. The interpreter stepped forward, his English accented but clear. "Chief Standing Elk speaks. You have taken what is most precious, the future of our people, the son of his blood. You have stolen him as the white man steals everything, land, buffalo, children. For this, you will answer." "I didn't steal anyone," Elias said, keeping his voice steady. "I found him. He was sick, dying. I helped him." The interpreter relayed this. The chief's response was sharp, disbelieving. The interpreter translated, "White men's words are smoke. Where is proof? Why should the chief believe you didn't take his son for trade, for money, for your government schools that steal Indian children?" This was the moment. Elias set down his bundle and picked up each item deliberately. First, the bowl. "This still has the food I first fed him, cornmeal and molasses. Look at it. Days old now, dried up. Would a kidnapper keep such a thing?" He held up the blankets next. "I made him a bed in my own cabin, not hidden, not locked away. A bed for a sick child who needed care." Then the torn fabric, He walked to his saw, showing where it still hung from the teeth. His shirt caught here when I carried him. The tear matches exactly. He was unconscious, burning with fever. I had to get him inside quickly. The warriors murmured among themselves. The chief's expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture shifted slightly. He spoke again, and the interpreter said, "These could be lies shaped after. Do you have more?" Elias was about to respond when Dakota suddenly stepped forward. The boy's voice rang out clear and strong in the night air, speaking rapidly in his own language. He pointed to Elias, to himself, made gestures that seemed to tell the whole story, getting lost, being found, being fed and cared for. He held up the toy horse Elias had carved, showing it to his father, then clutched it to his chest protectively. The chief's stern expression cracked slightly, seeing his son defending this white stranger. Dakota kept talking, his child's voice carrying surprising authority. He showed the skills Elias had taught him, counting in English, demonstrating the timber measuring stick. Then he showed what he'd taught Elias: medicinal plants, weather reading. His message was clear: this wasn't captivity. It was exchange. It was friendship. The clearing fell silent again. Father and son stared at each other across the space between them. Then Standing Elk spoke directly to Dakota, his voice softer but still serious. A question. By the tone. Dakota's answer was immediate. He ran to Elias and grabbed his hand, but then extended his other hand toward his father, not choosing one or the other, but trying to bridge both worlds. The chief studied this tableau for a long moment. The warriors waited, torches crackling, nobody moving. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then Standing Elk raised his hand, and every weapon lowered simultaneously. He spoke at length now, his voice measured, thoughtful. The interpreter translated in segments. The chief sees truth in his son's eyes. The boy is well, stronger even than before. This is not the work of an enemy. But the interpreter paused, listening to more. Trust broken many times between our peoples makes trust hard to find now. The chief must think, must counsel. You will wait. Standing Elk turned and spoke to his warriors. Several of them moved forward, not threatening but watchful, taking positions around the cabin. Guards, Elias realized. He and Dakota weren't prisoners, but they weren't free either. This was a test, and it wasn't over. The chief approached his son, kneeling to embrace him. Dakota hugged his father fiercely, speaking rapidly, gesturing toward Elias repeatedly. Standing Elk's eyes met Elias's over his son's head, measuring, evaluating, still deciding. Then the chief stood, said something to Dakota that made the boy nod solemnly, and walked back to his warriors. Most of them melted back into the forest, but at least 20 remained, setting up a camp at the edge of the clearing. The message was clear: we're watching, waiting, and deciding your fate. Dakota looked torn, standing between his father's retreating form and Elias's cabin. Finally, he chose to return to Elias's side, taking the big man's hand. Together, they walked back into the cabin, both understanding that the real test would come with dawn. Inside, Elias barred the door, not that it would stop 200 warriors, but the familiar action brought some comfort. Dakota was quiet, clutching the wooden horse, occasionally peering out the window at the campfires dotting the edge of his clearing. Your father's a fair man, Elias said finally. He'll see the truth. Dakota looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears, and spoke one of the few English words Elias had taught him: friend. Yes, Elias said, ruffling the boy's hair. Friends, no matter what comes tomorrow. And they sat together by the dying fire, neither able to sleep, waiting for dawn and whatever judgment it would bring. Outside, warrior voices carried on the night wind, debating in a language Elias couldn't understand about a friendship they'd never expected to see. Dawn came slowly, painting the mountains purple-gray, while mist rose from the river like departing ghosts. Elias hadn't slept, and neither had Dakota. They'd spent the night teaching each other words, Elias learning friend and trust in Lakota, Dakota mastering home and safe in English, small bridges built from syllables while warriors kept watch outside. The drums began again with first light, Different this time, slower, more ceremonial. Dakota straightened, recognizing something in the rhythm. He spoke rapidly in Lakota, then tried English. "Chief, talk. Now." They emerged from the cabin to find the clearing transformed. The warriors had formed a large circle, sitting cross-legged on the ground. At the center, Chief Standing Elk waited on a buffalo robe, his war paint replaced with ceremonial markings of white and blue. Beside him sat 3 elderly men, tribal elders, their faces mapped with years of wisdom. The interpreter approached Elias. "You will sit before the council. Speak truth. The chief will judge." Elias walked forward, Dakota at his side, and sat facing Standing Elk. Up close, he could see the man more clearly, the worry lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his hair. Not just a chief, but a father who'd spent 5 nights not knowing if his son lived. Standing Elk spoke first, his voice carrying to every warrior present. The interpreter translated, "My son left on his vision quest 5 suns ago. He was to spend 3 nights alone, finding his spirit guide, becoming a man. When he didn't return, we searched. Tracks led everywhere and nowhere. We feared wolves, bears, white soldiers. We feared schools that steal our children, never returning them." The chief's eyes fixed on Elias. "Then we find tracks leading here. My son's torn clothing on your white man's tool. Easy story to see white woodcutter finds Indian boy alone. Takes him. Maybe for bounty. Maybe for worse things we've seen before. This is the story my warriors tell. Now you tell yours." Elias took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've lived alone here 3 winters. I came west to escape my own ghosts, wanting nothing but peace and honest work. I take no part in the troubles between our peoples, never have, never will." He pointed to the sun, then counted backward on his fingers. 5 days ago, I was cutting timber when I heard something. Found your son collapsed near my eastern boundary, burning with fever, too weak to stand. I saw the markings on his necklace, knew he was important to someone." Standing Elk leaned forward slightly, and Elias continued. "I could have left him. Would have been easier, safer for me, but..." He paused, meeting the chief's eyes directly. "I lost my own nephew to fever 5 years ago. Watched him die while I stood helpless. Couldn't do that again, not even for a stranger's child." The interpreter relayed this, and murmurs rippled through the watching warriors. One of the elders spoke quietly to Standing Elk, who nodded and gestured for Elias to continue. "I carried him to my cabin, fed him, gave him water, cleaned his wounds. The fever broke that night. By morning, he was weak but aware. I showed him he was free to leave whenever he wanted, pointed to the forest. Made it clear. He chose to stay until he was stronger." Elias picked up the timber measuring stick, showing it to the council. "We taught each other. He showed me medicine plants, how to read weather and clouds. I showed him how to measure trees, work a pump handle, not captivity exchange. The way neighbors might share knowledge." Now Standing Elk spoke directly to Dakota in their language. The boy stood, small but straight, and began talking. His child's voice carried across the circle as he spoke for long minutes, occasionally pointing to Elias, sometimes demonstrating something the pump handle motion, playing an invisible harmonica, gathering berries. Then Dakota did something unexpected. He walked to his father and placed the wooden horse Elias had carved in Standing Elk's hands. He spoke earnestly, and the interpreter translated for Elias's benefit. "The boy says this white man gave him gifts expecting nothing, fed him when his own food was scarce, played music to chase away bad dreams. The boy says..." The interpreter paused, emotion crossing his face. "He says he found 2 fathers where he expected to find only spirits." The silence that followed was profound. Standing Elk turned the wooden horse over in his hands, studying the careful craftsmanship. His fingers traced the carved mane, the strong legs, the proud head. Such a small thing, but carved with patience and care. One of the elders spoke at length, his voice cracked with age but carrying authority. The interpreter translated. "Elder Walking Crow says the evidence speaks. No chains, no locks, No hidden room. The boy is healthy, happy even. But more, he sees something else. The white man and the boy learned from each other. This is the old way, before anger poisoned the wells between peoples. The second elder added his thoughts, translated as, the child was on a vision quest, seeking his guiding spirit. Perhaps the spirits led him here for a reason. Perhaps this meeting was meant to be. Standing Elk rose, and everyone fell silent. He walked slowly around Elias, studying him from every angle. Then he did something surprising. He examined Elias's hands, turning them over, studying the calluses, the scars from years of honest work. He spoke while doing this, the interpreter translating, "These are not the soft hands of a government man or soldier. These are hands like ours, hands that know work, wood, weather, hands that build rather than take." The chief returned to his place and spoke at length, his voice rising and falling like a song. The interpreter worked to keep up. Standing Elk speaks his judgment. The white man, Elias, acted with honor. He saved the chief's son when he could have turned away. He taught the boy useful things, treated him with dignity. For this, the chief owes a debt that cannot be measured in horses or pelts. Standing Elk stood again, pulling a decorated war lance from the ground beside him. The warriors tensed, but the chief walked to Elias's cabin and drove the lance into the ground beside the door. He spoke loudly, clearly, making a proclamation. "This ground is now protected. Any who bring harm to this man brings harm to Standing Elk himself. The woodcutter is adopted into our protection. He stands between worlds, white and Indian, as my son now stands between childhood and manhood." The chief returned and extended his hand to Elias, not the traditional warrior's grip, but the white man's handshake. Elias took it, feeling the strength and sincerity in the grasp. "But know this," Standing Elk added through the interpreter, his tone serious. "My son's quest is not complete. He must still find his vision. He will stay here 3 more days, then return to his people. You will teach him what more you can. He will teach you. When he leaves, the path between your door and our camp will remain. Do you accept?" Elias looked at Dakota, who was beaming, tears streaming down his young face. "I accept." What followed was unexpected, a celebration. Warriors brought out drums, not for war, but for recognition. Food appeared from Pax pemmican, dried berries, fry bread, cooked over quickly built fires. The stern-faced warriors who'd threatened him the night before now shared their meal with him, showing through gestures their respect for his protection of their chief's son. Dakota moved between both groups, his people and Elias, like a small ambassador. He translated simple words, demonstrated the games Elias had taught him, showed warriors the timber measuring stick with obvious pride. As the sun reached its peak, Standing Elk approached Elias one more time, this time with the interpreter and a warrior carrying something wrapped in deerskin. The chief spoke. "You fed my son when he was hungry. Now we share food with you." He gestured to the supplies. The warrior set down enough dried meat and preserved vegetables to last a month. "You gave him shelter. Now your shelter is ours to protect." He pointed to the lance by the door. "You taught him your ways. Now," he paused, pulled out an eagle feather from his robes. "You will learn ours." He placed the feather in Elias's hand. "This marks you as a protector of children among our people. This is the highest honor a warrior can earn. You earned it not through battle but through kindness. This is the way the world should be." As the afternoon waned, most of the warriors prepared to leave. They would return in 3 days for Dakota, but for now, there was peace, understanding, even friendship beginning to grow from the seed of one man's kindness and one boy's courage to speak truth. Elias stood in his doorway, eagle feather in one hand, Dakota's small hand in the other, watching Standing Elk's warriors disappear into the forest. 3 more days with the boy. Then a new chapter would begin, one where his lonely clearing would become a bridge between worlds. The chief looked back once, raised his hand in farewell, and called out something in Lakota. Dakota translated. Grinning, he says, "You are good man." He says, "My son, lucky to find you." Tell him, Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. I was the lucky one. The 3 days that followed the judgment passed like a dream. Dakota threw himself into learning everything Elias could teach, as if trying to store up knowledge for the separation ahead. They worked from dawn to dusk, Elias showing him how to read tree rings for age, how to sharpen a saw properly, how to tell good lumber from wood that would warp and crack. Dakota reciprocated by teaching Elias to track deer through barely visible signs, to find water by watching birds, to predict weather changes by the way leaves turned in the wind. On the morning of the 3rd day, they both knew without speaking that it was time. Dakota packed his few belongings, the wooden horse, a small knife Elias had given him, a piece of quartz they'd found by the river that caught the light like captured stars. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing every corner of the cabin that had become his second home. The drums announced the return before the warriors became visible. This time, Elias felt no fear at the sound, only a bittersweet ache. Dakota stood straighter, transforming from the playful child of the past days back into the chief's son, though his eyes remained soft when they looked at Elias. Standing Elk emerged from the tree line with only a small group this time, perhaps 20 warriors, the 3 elders, and several women who must have been important to the tribe. Among them walked a woman whose face was Dakota's in feminine form, his mother, her eyes red from crying but her bearing dignified. She looked at Elias with an expression he couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something else. Evaluation. Perhaps. The chief approached with the interpreter. The boy has told us much through our runners these 3 days. You taught him well. He says he wants to learn the white man's writing, to make marks that speak. This is good. Our children must know both worlds to survive what comes. Standing Elk's expression darkened slightly. Changes come whether we fight them or not. Better to understand than to remain blind. He gestured to one of the warriors, who brought forward a bundle. We bring gifts, as is proper between friends. Inside the deerskin wrapping were things of beauty and utility, a bow of polished wood with a quiver of arrows, a blanket woven with patterns that seemed to shift in the light, a knife with an antler handle carved with symbols Elias couldn't read. I have little to give in return, Elias began, but Standing Elk raised his hand. You gave us back our future. You gave my son understanding that not all white faces hide dark hearts. This knowledge may save lives someday. The chief paused, then added something that the interpreter seemed reluctant to translate. After Standing Elk spoke more firmly, the interpreter said, The chief says, in his heart, he wishes his son could stay longer, learn more. But the boy must complete his vision quest properly, with his people. You understand? I understand, Elias said, though his throat felt tight. A boy needs his people, his family. Dakota's mother stepped forward then, approaching Elias with careful grace. She spoke, her voice melodious and sad, and the interpreter translated. Mourning Dove thanks you for her son's life. She says. He paused, listening. She says you have the heart of a father. She sees how her son looks at you. She asks if you have children of your own. No, Elias said quietly. Never married. No children. Mourning Dove spoke again, and the interpreter's eyes widened slightly before translating. She says the spirits are strange in their gifts. They took her son away but gave him another father. They took your family but gave you a son for a brief time. Perhaps this is not ending but beginning. She reached into her robe and pulled out something that made several warriors murmur in surprise, a strand of white shell beads, polished to pearl-like brilliance. She placed them around Elias's neck, speaking words the interpreter translated with obvious reverence. These are wampum of the old agreements, from when our peoples first met in peace. She gives them to you as a bridge maker. Very great honor. Standing Elk now performed something that seemed ceremonial. He had Elias and Dakota stand side by side, then spoke in both Lakota and had the interpreter translate. Let all witness, this white man, Elias Hartley, is recognized as uncle to my son. protector of our children, friend to our people. The path between his door and our camps is open. Any who harm him, harm us all." He then did something that surprised everyone. He spoke in accented but clear English. "You saved my boy. I practice English for 3 days to say you are good man. My heart thanks your heart." The chief's attempt at English broke something in Elias's composure. His eyes burned with unshed tears as he gripped Standing Elk's offered arm in the warrior's fashion. "Your son brought light to my dark cabin. I thank you for trusting me with him." Now came the hard part. Dakota approached Elias, trying to be brave, but his lower lip trembling slightly. Elias knelt, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "You remember everything I taught you?" Elias asked. Dakota nodded. "Remember," he said in English, then switched to Lakota, speaking earnestly. The interpreter translated, "He says he will practice English every day. He will remember the songs you played. He will keep the horse always. And I'll remember everything you taught me," Elias said. "Every plant, every weather sign, every word of Lakota." Dakota suddenly threw his arms around Elias's neck, abandoning all pretense of dignity. Elias hugged him back. This small boy who'd changed his world in a handful of days. Over Dakota's shoulder, he saw Standing Elk watching with understanding eyes, one father recognizing another's pain. When they finally separated, Dakota pulled something from his pouch, a small piece of worked flint, shaped like an arrowhead but decorated with tiny etched symbols. He pressed it into Elias's palm, speaking quickly. The interpreter said, "His first successful arrowhead, made 2 seasons ago. He says keep it. Remember him." "Always," Elias promised. As the group prepared to leave, Standing Elk made an announcement that the interpreter relayed. "The chief says traders will come in 1 moon. You may trade freely, fairly. He also says—" The interpreter smiled slightly. "His son will visit when possible, to practice English, to learn more white man ways, if you accept. Tell the chief his son will always be welcome. My door is open to him always." The procession began to move away, Dakota walking between his parents but looking back frequently. Just before they entered the forest, the boy broke from his parents' hands and ran back to Elias one more time. "Friend," he said in English, then added something in Lakota that needed no translation. The tone said everything: gratitude, affection, promise to return. Then he was gone, swallowed by the forest with his people, leaving Elias standing alone in his clearing that suddenly felt emptier than it had ever been. But not empty in the old way, the hollow way. This was different, a space waiting to be filled again, a pause between chapters rather than an ending. The war lance still stood beside his door, its feathers stirring in the afternoon breeze. The wampum beads lay cool against his chest. Inside the cabin, evidence of Dakota's presence remained everywhere, the small bed still made up in the corner, drawings in charcoal on scraps of bark, the river cane flute left behind on the table. Elias picked up the flute, played the simple melody Dakota had taught him. The notes carried across the clearing, through the trees, maybe far enough for the boy to hear. An answer came, distant but clear, Dakota's voice raised in a Lakota farewell song, growing fainter as the group moved away. That evening, Elias sat in his doorway, the eagle feather in one hand, Dakota's arrowhead in the other. The clearing was quiet but not silent. He could hear the river, the wind, the first owls of evening. But now he also heard possibility, connection, the promise of voices returning. He thought about Mourning Dove's words, not an ending but a beginning. Tomorrow, he'd start preparing for traders, for visits, for his cabin to become what Standing Elk had proclaimed a place between worlds. He'd need more furniture, more supplies, maybe even expand the cabin itself. The thought energized him in a way nothing had for years. As stars emerged overhead, Elias noticed something new, a trail clearly visible now where none had been before, leading from his door into the forest toward the tribal lands. A path made by many feet over 3 days, marked by bent branches and strategically placed stones. They'd made it obvious, deliberate, permanent. "Until next time, little friend," he said to the darkness, then went inside to plan for a future that suddenly held more promise than he'd ever imagined. The cabin didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was waiting, ready for the next chapter of an unlikely story that had begun with simple kindness and grown into something larger, a bridge between peoples who'd forgotten they could be friends. And at the center of that bridge stood a lonely woodcutter who'd found family in the most unexpected place, and a brave boy who'd shown two worlds how to see each other clearly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new preparations. But tonight, Elias Hartley sat by his fire, playing a Lakota melody on his harmonica, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, a small boy clutched a wooden horse and remembered the songs they'd shared. The peace that settled over him was different from the isolation he'd sought. It was connection, purpose, and the promise of voices returning to fill his clearing with life. 3 moons had passed since the day Dakota left with his people, and Elias's clearing had transformed beyond recognition. Where once a single cabin stood in isolation, now there was purpose, community, and constant motion. The November air carried the scent of wood smoke and tanned hides, the sound of voices in 2 languages, the laughter of children who knew no borders between worlds. The trading post had begun simply a lean-to attached to his cabin where Standing Elk's people could leave furs and take lumber in fair exchange. But word spread as word does in the wilderness, carried by trappers and travelers, and soon white settlers from the valley below were making the journey up the mountain to trade with the Indians at Hartley's place. Elias had become, without planning it, the trusted middleman both sides needed. This morning, he stood watching a scene that would have been impossible to imagine 3 months ago. Dakota was teaching the Morrison boy, a towhead from a homestead 5 miles downriver, how to read deer tracks in the frost, while the boy's sister played the cup and pin game with 2 Lakota girls near the fire pit Elias had built for communal gatherings. Their parents sat at his expanded table, working out a trade wool blankets for beaded leather goods that would fetch high prices in Denver. Uncle Eli, Dakota called, using the name he'd adopted for Elias. The boy had grown in 3 months, taller and stronger, but his smile remained unchanged. "Show James the tree measuring. He doesn't believe me about the numbers." Elias retrieved his timber cruiser's stick, demonstrating again the Doyle scale calculations while both boys watched with rapt attention. Dakota translated for the Lakota children who'd gathered to watch, his English now flowing and confident. The boy spent half his time with his people and half at the clearing, building bridges with every word he spoke. Standing Elk arrived at midday with a hunting party, bringing fresh venison to share. The chief had also changed in these months. His English improved, his initial wariness replaced by genuine friendship. He clasped Elias's arm in greeting, then surprised him by saying in careful English, "Good to see you, my friend. The hunters found big herd to the north. Winter will be good. Your English gets better every time," Elias said, genuinely impressed. Standing Elk smiled, a rare expression that transformed his stern features. "Dakota teaches, says I must learn to speak with my white brother." He paused, then added with dry humor, "My white brother who cannot properly skin a deer without my son's help." They both laughed, remembering Elias's clumsy first attempts at the task. The laughter drew Mourning Dove from where she'd been teaching settler women the art of pemmican making. She'd become a regular visitor too, treating Elias with the warm respect of actual family. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors, a cavalry patrol from Fort Laramie, led by a young lieutenant who looked suspicious and uncomfortable. His hand rested on his sidearm as he surveyed the mixed gathering. "Mr. Hartley," the lieutenant said stiffly, "we've had reports of unusual activity here. Indians and settlers mixing freely. Some folks down in the valley are concerned." Before Elias could respond, Standing Elk stepped forward. From his pouch, he produced a document that made the lieutenant's eyes widen, a treaty paper signed by the territorial governor, recognizing Standing Elk's band's right to trade freely and Elias's post as legitimate. The chief had ridden 2 days to the territorial capital to secure it, understanding the white man's need for written authority. All legal, Lieutenant, Elias said mildly. Just folks trading and getting along. No law against that. Is there? The lieutenant looked around again, taking in the peaceful scene, children playing together, women sharing cooking techniques, men discussing the coming winter. His rigid posture slowly relaxed. I suppose not. But Washington won't like hearing about whites and Indians getting too friendly. Then maybe, Standing Elk said in his accented English, Washington needs better eyes to see. We are not just white and Indian here. We are neighbors. The lieutenant had no answer to that. He and his patrol left soon after, but not before one of his soldiers traded tobacco for a pair of beautifully beaded gloves, sheepishly admitting they were for his girl back home. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the gathering took on the feel of celebration. Someone had brought a fiddle old Tom Morrison, it turned out, who'd kept it hidden in his wagon for years. He struck up a lively tune, and soon Lakota drums joined in, creating a rhythm that was neither fully white nor Indian but something entirely new. Children danced together, their parents clapping along. Elias found himself pulled into the circle by Dakota and the Morrison girl, stumbling through steps that seemed to be invented on the spot. Even Standing Elk was convinced to join, his dignity intact despite his warrior's attempt at a Virginia reel. As darkness fell and families began preparing to leave, some heading down the mountain to homesteads, others into the forest to the tribal winter camp, Standing Elk drew Elias aside. They stood together at the edge of the firelight, looking out at the mixed gathering. When you found my son, the chief said slowly in English, I thought you were enemy, thief. All white men seemed the same takers, breakers of promises. He paused, choosing words carefully. You showed me different truth. Not all whites are same. Not all Indians are same. Each man chooses who he is. Your son taught me the same thing, Elias replied. I came here running from people, wanting to be alone. Dakota showed me that being alone isn't the same as being at peace. Icho, Standing Elk nodded, then pulled something from his robe, a pipe, carved with intricate designs. This was my father's, his father's before him. I give to you now. Before Elias could protest the magnitude of the gift, Standing Elk continued. You stand between waters, like your name says. Neither white world nor Indian world, but bridge between. This is sacred work. Dangerous sometimes, but sacred. They smoked together in companionable silence, watching the last of the visitors prepare to leave. Dakota ran up, dividing his goodbye hugs equally between Elias and his father, promising to return in 2 days to help with the new addition to the cabin, a proper trading room with shelves and storage. As the clearing emptied, Elias found himself not alone but simply peaceful. The cabin that had once been his refuge from humanity had become humanity's gathering place. The forest that had hidden him now brought people to him. The silence he'd sought had been replaced by something better, the sound of communities learning to live as one. He thought about the letter he'd received last week from his sister in Ohio, expressing shock that her hermit brother was now running a trading post. She'd asked if he was happy, a question he couldn't have answered 6 months ago. Now the answer was clear. The next morning brought the first real snow of winter, fat flakes drifting down like promises. Elias stood in his doorway, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the world turn white and clean. The path to the tribal camp remained visible, packed down by constant use. Soon, Dakota would come racing through the snow, eager to work on the trading room, full of stories from both his worlds. A movement caught his eye, a lone figure approaching through the snow. As it got closer, he saw it was a young Lakota woman he didn't recognize, carrying a baby bundled against the cold. She looked exhausted, frightened, but she was heading deliberately for his cabin. When she reached the door, she spoke in broken English. You, stands between waters, help man, Standing Elk says. You help. Yes, Elias said, already opening his door wider. Come in. Get warm. Whatever you need. as he helped her inside, gave her coffee and food, listened to her story of a husband injured in a hunting accident. Elias realized this would be his life now, not the solitary existence he'd planned, but something richer, more complex. He was the bridge, the safe ground, the neutral territory where help could be found regardless of which world you came from. By the time the sun set on that snowy day, the woman's husband had been brought in on a travois, tended by both Mourning Dove's medicine knowledge and the frontier doctoring Elias had learned in the war. White settlers and Lakota warriors worked together to bring firewood, food, support. The cabin overflowed with people determined to help because this was their place now, all of them, together. Standing Elk's words echoed in the crowded cabin. Stands between waters. It was more than a name. It was a calling, a purpose Elias had never expected to find in his self-imposed exile. As he looked around at the faces red and white, young and old, all united in simple human kindness, he knew he'd found something worth more than the solitude he'd sought. He'd found home, not in a place but in a purpose, not in isolation but in connection. The lonely woodcutter who'd wanted nothing from the world had become the center of a new world being born one friendship, one kindness, one shared meal at a time. Outside. The snow continued to fall, covering the old boundaries and divisions, making everything equal under its white blanket. And somewhere in that snow, a path remained clear, the path between worlds that a lost boy and a lonely man had begun to build, now traveled by many feet, leading to a future none of them could have imagined, but all of them were choosing, together. You know, friend. I've told you this story because sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as interruptions. Elias thought he wanted solitude, built walls of wilderness around his wounded heart. Then a dying child stumbled into his clearing, and everything he thought he knew about peace crumbled like old bark. Real family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who see you at your loneliest and choose to stay anyway. That boy Dakota gave Elias more than companionship, he gave him purpose. And Standing Elk, fierce chief who could have chosen vengeance, chose to see the truth instead. He looked past the color of Elias's skin to the kindness in his actions. Gratitude changes everything it touches. When Elias saved Dakota expecting nothing in return, he received a whole community. When Standing Elk offered trust instead of suspicion, he built a bridge that hundreds would eventually cross. The cabin that started as one man's escape became everyone's sanctuary. Not because Elias was special, but because he learned what we all must learn, that our hearts grow stronger when we share their shelter with others, and the warmth we give away always finds its way back home.